But there are a number of very good reasons to like Africa, and they are deeply embedded reasons that point to sustainable growth. Despite rising external financing costs and a deceleration in key export markets like the EU, and even subdued commodity prices, sub-Saharan Africa over the course of the last number of years has been able to show sustained growth. So given that the EU still plays a very important role in African economies, and given a global financial crisis, Africa's sustainable growth in the last few years has been solid and it hasn't flagged. That is a positive. It indicates to me that there are legs to the African growth story. Government debt in Africa is still under control. I think it's creeping up in many African countries, and it's true to say that many African countries still don't have high levels of government debt simply because they don't provide a cushion to their populace, as we do in South Africa, where we have, of course, social income grants and pensions for 15, 16 million South Africans. This, I think, is yet to take root in Africa. And as I think Africans move into the middle classes, as I think these economies develop, this level of debt to GDP, government debt in particular in Africa, could very well rise into the future. But for the moment, still relatively manageable in terms of global comparisons. Inflation across Africa has dropped, and it's dropped more or less to below GDP growth rates. And that's pretty good news for the continent as well. And what I like about Africa, it's understanding full well that the way to becoming competitive, in a sense, is to find partners, not necessarily business partners, but partners with your neighbor. And I think this consolidation of Africa's trading blocks is a critical part of Africa's future success. It will alleviate bottlenecks. I think it will cut red tape. We know that the improvement of visa regimes, particularly coming out of the Eastern African trading corridor, I think is going to be one of the big pluses in doing business in that particular area. And I think this will extend indeed to West Africa and elsewhere as well. So I think there's there are a number of good reasons to like Africa, and it's not just me saying this. We can just see where the new foreign direct investment hotspots are across the continent. There are no real surprises. As usual, it's East Africa, it's West Africa, it's Mozambique, it's Southern Africa as well. But still, these are the key growth areas for the continent. Africa has become in vogue, strange enough, not just, of course, because of what Africans have been doing, but it's become in vogue because of external factors. Of course, that's the great migration that takes place on the East African plains every single year. And there's been a great migration of capital across the world as a result of the global financial crisis, as a result of very, very low interest rates in the Western world. Investors are looking for a return on investment. And they've taken risks in the last 5 years. They've expanded their horizons to move beyond the United States and Western Europe and Japan and Southeast Asia to look for more, greater returns on investment from developing markets and in particular from Africa. And it's remarkable, the quantity of investment vehicles that now come from this continent. It's put Africa on the map. So ironically, in a sense, the global financial crisis has had a positive effect on Africa. It's put Africa effectively on the front burner of investment opportunities. It may be risky to many, but now it's a seriously considered avenue for investment. Of course, with the migration of capital to Africa can very well come the migration of capital from Africa should governance in Africa remain fragile and not live up to its promise. So there's a double-edged sword, I suppose, to the ease of movement of capital today in the world. We know it can come and it can go. It can flow both ways, literally at the click of a mouse, and Africa has to be warned certainly about that. A positive for Africa certainly has been the global bond issues from so many African countries that have been taken up so readily. These global bond issues have raised capital clearly, but they've shown that there's confidence. There's confidence from investors looking to diversify their portfolios. And this has clearly been exciting. It's also offered, I think, many of these countries to raise capital and, of course, to contemplate building infrastructure. Infrastructure is not just an African feature. It's a feature of the broader global world and the feature of the developing world, and in particular a feature, of course, of global giants like China. This is a city in China called Chongqing. I always put a picture of the city into every presentation that I do because you may not have heard of Chongqing here in the audience. Some of you might have a holiday home in Chongqing or a yacht on the rather muddy-looking river that encircles Chongqing. But why do I put Chongqing into my presentation? Because this city has a population of 30 million people in the greater Chongqing area. 30 million. 50 years ago, there were 250,000 people living here. It was a relatively small village in the Chinese parlance. People have moved from rural to urban in this part of China and elsewhere across that great country. They want security. They want commodity security. This is another city in China. I've showed you Chongqing. I'll take you now to a city called Qingdao. Qingdao up in northern China. Northern China, I was up in Qingdao. I was taken there by the Chinese government, a very interesting trip. And my host said to me, Daniel, you've got a free day in Qingdao. What would you like to do? Would you like to go to the beach? Or, indeed, yes, indeed. Or would you like to go and visit the local brewery? And you know they've got a very fine beer in Qingdao, as I found out. Surprise, surprise, I took the brewery tour. But when you take a look at the beach and you take a look at the quantity of people, and I could be showing you a picture of a lot of people in India or in Pakistan or in Turkey or in Egypt, people. It's about people. It's about food security for these people. It's about water security in particular for these people, particularly in China and India, where there are going to be substantial and already are water shortages. It's about commodity security, providing homes for these people, providing industry to employ these people. All of these aspects of the security for growing populations around the world, of course, cause countries to look beyond their own borders for security. And where does China look? And where does many other countries of the world look? They look to our continent here. Africa today represents about 60% of the available cropland left in the world. It's on our continent. And there has been a scramble, in a sense, for African land in particular. A fair amount of land on this continent has been acquired by foreign powers, foreign countries, for the extraction of agribusiness products back to their home countries. A very controversial issue across this continent is the acquisition of land, fertile land, where the agri products are in fact not staying at home, they're leaving our continental shores. China's role in Africa, as we know, has been substantial. It is now Africa's largest trading partner as a percentage of total trade. And again, the red line on the screen simply just gives you an indication visually of this dramatic rise in China's role on the African continent. In a sense, China's embrace of Africa clearly has run simultaneously with Africa's economic growth. So we could all have a discussion on whether Africa's growth in the last decade has been because of Africa, or has Africa's growth in the last decade been because of this dynamic economy called China, to a lesser extent India and many other developing markets, who have put really Africa as their front burner investment destination in order to secure those commodity food and water security sources for themselves. And we can debate that, of course, for many hours. China's role in Africa is controversial. Some see China as a neo-colonialist power. I do see China as being beneficial to Africa, but I tell you, I think China's had its outstanding decade in terms of its African liaisons. I think it's had the best of times in the last decade, and I think it's going to be a lot more difficult in a sense in future, more competitive for China, and I think there's going to be a lot more conditionality from African governments when looking at Chinese investment and infrastructure-led projects on the African continent. That's not to say that the Chinese will not be in Africa, but I think they themselves also will find themselves under pressure over the course of the next decade. What's critical for Africa about China is the potential reliance that this continent has, and in particular certain countries, on the Chinese economic story. China has a voracious commodity appetite, and I put up on the screen just some of the core commodities that China uses and uses in great abundance. You know, China currently consumes 53% of all global cement in the world, consumed by the Chinese. And I tell you what's fascinating is that by some estimates, China has poured more concrete for its roads, railroads, dams, bridges, factories, and skyscrapers in the 3 years between 2009 and 2011 than America did during the entire 20th century. Such has been the rapid industrialization of China, some might say over-industrialization of China. When you look at the figures, when you look to see that 46% of all pig products in the world are consumed by the Chinese, 37% of all eggs in the world are consumed by the Chinese, well, you have to obviously constantly watch that Chinese economic growth story to see whether there's any kind of downward trend or slope in their economy. And clearly we've seen that there has been something of a moderate drop in their GDP growth rates. The Chinese, I think, are in a sort of a soft landing territory. I mean, if you're going to continue, you won't continue to grow at 9 or 10 or 11% for decades and decades and decades. But if you can still grow, as the Chinese are, at about 7.5 or 7.6, 7.7% GDP per annum, in a country with 1.3 billion people, and in a country where average growth in the last number of years has been 7, 8, 9, 10, 11%, you are still doing remarkably well. So I think this Chinese economic story is certainly not in any danger of essentially negatively affecting the African growth story, but there's no doubt that Africa needs to be well aware, everyone doing business in Africa, every African government needs to be well aware that Africa needs to use its own resources. It shouldn't be as reliant on the outside world as I believe it continues to be, given China's big push into the continent in the last decade. Less than 30% of Africa's labor force is in stable wage-paying employment. And clearly creating that wage-paying employment, domestic employment, on the continent is absolutely critical. Africa has 12% of global oil reserves, 40% of gold, 80% of chromium and platinum, but only 1% of global manufacturing. Only 1% of global manufacturing? You cannot continue, I believe, to have sustainable growth unless you have sustainable domestic inward investment as well, and not become so reliant upon third parties or outside parties. That remains a tremendous challenge for Africa to provide that. And as a result, I think, despite the big and glowing and glossy GDP growth figures that I can show you, similarly, I can show you that Africa's competitiveness, most African countries lag substantially in the Global Competitiveness Report. And again, whether it's the regulatory environment, the logistical environment, or contributing to Africa perhaps not really playing its rightful role as yet. There's still work to be done. For foreign business coming into Africa, Africa is rising as an attractive investment destination, and in fact, its attractiveness has risen remarkably over the course of the last 3 years or so. And you can just see on this chart from the Ernst & Young Africa Attractiveness Report how Africa is now perceived so much more positively in the outside world. And here, of course, is the key, I suppose, the key good news, in a sense, for your industry. Average African GDP for the next 30 years could rise sixfold. Per capita income can rise above $10,000 for all African countries. Power generation capacity will need to increase sixfold to 2040. Transport volumes will increase 6 to 8 times. And in fact, those volumes can increase up to 14 times for some landlocked countries. Port throughput is going to rise 265 million tons in 2009 to more than 2 billion tons by 2040. I mean, these are real predictions. And of course, broadband demand is going to swell by a factor of 20 by 2020 alone. I mean, a remarkable stage of development, as I've said, notwithstanding some of the caveats or challenges that I mentioned exist on this continent. A tremendous challenge and opportunity clearly is in the environmental space on this continent. And indeed, when we talk about sustainability, one of the core aspects of sustainability of growth on the African continent is use of energy, demand for energy, and also resultant demand for water. And I must tell you, both are going to be extreme challenges for this continent, and both offer, I think, in terms of your industry, tremendous opportunity for investment projects in the course of the next few decades. In the SADC countries closer to home, transit traffic for landlocked SADC countries are going to increase and increase dramatically, as the figures indicate. Roads have improved to some degree, but rail lines are still lacking Rail is going to be a key focus, I think. And I tell you, most regional ports are currently operating near or over capacity, causing long and very expensive delays in logistics as well. There's great work to be done, and if Africa wishes to sustain this level of growth, it will have to meet its logistical challenge that places much of Africa in the bottom rung when globally ranking countries in terms of their logistics. And I haven't got time to go through all of the figures on the table in front of you, but you know, as all of you know, it still costs to do business in Africa, and those costs are passed on to the consumer. I know I've just been in Malawi only in the last couple of weeks. I went into a Pep store in Malawi where I was astounded by some of the prices for T-shirts and basics in that Pep store. And if you look at the charts and you look at the graphs of what it costs to import a container, you'll just see on the last column on that particular slide how to import a container into East Asia costs $958 per container. But in Burundi, it costs $2,567. It costs $5,000 in Burundi, $2,000 in Kenya, $2,000 in Sudan, $3,000 in Zambia, and $5,000 in Zimbabwe. So there's a long way to go, and you will play a role, of course, in easing the infrastructure backlog, in a sense, through, of course, the corridors, gateways, and infrastructure projects that are now on the cards in Africa. And if this oil boom, I might add, comes to fruition, and we see good signs that all of these exploration sites are going to come on stream, well, clearly, I'm not sure what backlog is indeed going to be adequately addressed very soon. There's going to be tremendous pent-up demand. Talking about pent-up demand, Africa's population growth over the course of the next 70, 80 years is going to be nothing short of phenomenal. Some see populations as very disconcerting, big population growth areas. I like big populations. I like big populations of young people, able and willing to do the work, wanting to take their countries forward. Just look at the chart. Look at the chart of the top 10 most populous countries in the world projected by the United Nations to 2100. Out of that chart, Nigeria is number 3. Look at that. Just under 1 billion people expected to be in Nigeria at current levels of population growth by 2100. Isn't that remarkable? And look to see Tanzania, the DRC, Ethiopia, and Uganda, all 200, 300 million plus countries by 2100. The market for goods and services is in Africa, and indeed the market for goods and services is going to be increasingly in that urban environment. I don't want anybody here in Gauteng to complain about their traffic anymore. You need a good little Sunday afternoon visit to Lagos just to give you some perspective in life. I mean, Africa in 2010 had 51 cities with more than 1 million residents. By 2040, they will have 100 cities of more than 1 million residents and about 7 cities topping 10 million. And I tell you, when you look at the population expected of Lagos by 2050, Lagos's population will be close to 40 million people in the greater Lagos area by 2040. Kinshasa, 30 million people. These are massive figures, and I think massive figures that one simply can't get one's head around. The pressure on cities and urban infrastructure, I think, is going to cry out for business into the future if it isn't already, and you should be involved in those sectors. Urbanization, I'm pleased to say, generally speaking, according to most economists, leads to rising incomes. But urbanization clearly is fraught with problems. It's fraught with poor management, it's fraught with cost cutting, it's fraught across this continent also with substandard delivery. And I think clearly this is an issue that has to be tackled in terms of raising the quality of building, the quality of your product as well. We've seen problems with this using inferior products, in particularly, I might add, in Nigeria. And I don't mean to single out Nigeria specifically. African infrastructure is going to require billions of dollars, $90 billion per year in the next 10 years, just to get that infrastructure up to scratch. And look how difficult it is to fund this infrastructure. It is estimated that it'll cost more than $20 billion to improve Mozambique's ports and railways, more than $20 billion. But the GDP of Mozambique back in 2012 was $14 billion. So there's a long way to go in terms of getting the infrastructure up to scratch, but nevertheless, I think your industry is going to be at the forefront of it, particularly when it comes to environmentally friendly products that I think are starting now to see fruition. That might be overkill, I might add, in terms of certainly the African environment, but it gives you an idea, I think, of using the opportunity to at least make Africa's cities smarter in terms of your technologies that you will discuss in this conference, the use, I think, of green technologies and smart city technologies and the liaison and working this into urban planning is going to be a critical challenge and should be one for your industry. Some companies are doing this quite effectively, I understand, and I think it is well worth pursuing. I think it's a front burner issue. Just finally, clearly, I think one of the big challenges, and we might discuss it on the panel, is the issue of funding and the issue of risks on the African continent. Risks associated with the delivery and operation of infrastructure projects negatively affect the cost of finances. They add to costs. And unblocking important investment opportunities in infrastructure projects by involving indeed the private sector, PPPs and other public institutions, still a challenge on the African continent. So, my friends, I think we are at the cusp of, and I think we're not at the cusp, we're in it already, of this window of opportunity for Africa to start to play a critical role in the global economy. It can do it. It has to do it from within as well. It can't just rely upon the vagaries and volatility of the global economic scene. It has to develop its own industries, and it has to be smart about applying product, good standards, the regulatory and governmental environments as well domestically. Global and domestic factors, therefore, are now shifting Africa from being judged in the past for its vulnerabilities, as The Economist magazine did, towards being judged for its possibilities. And I must say, I'm very happy to work in any environment in which what's possible is much more exciting than what's vulnerable and what's negative. I think that's where we are currently. I wish you well in your conference. Now is the time, I think, to look at the African market. Don't wait for later. This is the unique window. Thank you very much for your attention this morning.